Good evening. I'm Sean Decatur, president of Kenyon College, and welcome to tonight's event organized by our Center for the Study of American Democracy. I am delighted that so many alumni, as well as current students, faculty, and staff have tuned in tonight, and I'd like to offer a special welcome to the prospective Kenyon students in attendance and the new recently admitted members of the class of 2025. This fall, the Center for Study of American Democracy, in conjunction with the Office of Alumni and Parent Engagement, convened a series of 6 online alumni panels to consider in depth the question, is the American experiment still viable? To assess the health of American democracy in what appeared to be one of the country's most consequential elections in memory. Tonight, we convene a 7th unplanned panel in that series, a non-peaceful transition, to consider one of the darkest weeks in American history that casts this question into stark relief. It began with a deadly assault on the Capitol on January 6th by supporters of the president to halt the naming of his successor, and culminated yesterday with the bipartisan impeachment of the president by the House of Representatives. Though incredibly shocking jolts, these events are a reflection of the weaknesses in our democracy that have been growing not just in recent years, not just in one administration, but for generations. This includes declining trust and confidence in democratic institutions, declining influences of facts, data, and truth in discourse and decision-making, and deeply rooted racism and injustice. The assault on the Capitol was not a sudden explosion, but rather analogous to an earthquake, a violent shock erupting from many years of built-up pressure along long-standing fault lines. These are fault lines that will not heal quickly, nor will they be patched simply by the inauguration of a new administration. An earthquake causes permanent changes in the geology and geography, and ultimately leads to resilience and renewal of the physical landscape. How to respond to challenges raised by these political events in ways that strengthen the resilience of our democratic institutions and create the conditions necessary for civic renewal are central questions of our time. Our goal this evening is to engage in rigorous deliberative inquiry, a deep probing and civil discussion that enables us to understand our current moment with greater depth and clarity, identify the fundamental challenges we now confront, and better weigh the alternatives we face in seeking to manage them. I'd like to thank the Offices of Alumni and Parent Engagement, Communication Advancement, and especially Lindsay Colopy, Adam Gilson, Annie Gordon, and Kent Woodward-Ginther. Brittany Balo of Library and Information Services provided technical support. I'd also like to thank the Center for Study of American Democracy, especially Andrea Leckleitner and Nancy Powers, as well as the CSAD student associates, Teresa Carr, class of 23, Max Onosorg, class of 21, and William Yannick, class of 23. We also like to thank the alumni, faculty, parents, and friends of the college with whom we consulted as we put this program together, and you, members of the audience, for participating in this vital discussion. And now it's my pleasure to introduce David Rowe, Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center for Study of American Democracy.
Thank you, Sean, and welcome everyone. I welcome you to tonight's special alumni panel, a non-peaceful transfer, to consider the implications for American democracy of the aftermath of the 2020 presidential election. This panel, as Sean has mentioned, is an addendum to the fall series of 6 alumni online panels that explored the question, is the American experiment still viable? Wednesday, January 6, 2021, marks one of the darkest days of American history. We witnessed the violent and deadly storming of the Capitol by supporters of a sitting president to halt the counting of the Electoral College votes and the official naming of his successor. Many who stormed the Capitol actually believed themselves to be saving American democracy. They were animated by beliefs that the election had been stolen through a fraud of massive proportions, beliefs first seeded by the president before the election took place, and repeated by the president even as marauders occupied the Capitol, a Capitol policeman sustained fatal injuries, and members of the Congress and their staffs feared for their lives. And yet it is also clear that these beliefs have no real basis in fact. The United States Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency stated on November 12 that, quote, there is no evidence that any voting system deleted or lost votes, changed votes, or was in any way compromised. The president's Attorney General, William Barr, stated on December 1st that, quote, we have not seen fraud on a scale that could have affected a different outcome in the election, nor have charges of electoral fraud or other challenges to the validity or the integrity of the election gained purchase or proved persuasive in the country's courts of law, including the United States Supreme Court. nor did recounts and electoral audits in swing states, including a hand recount in the state of Georgia, reveal any systematic irregularities. As Senate Republican Majority Leader Mitch McConnell stated in a speech on the Senate floor on January 6, nothing before us proves illegality anywhere near the massive scale that would have tipped this entire election, nor can public doubt alone justify a radical break when that doubt was incited without evidence. This election was not unusually close. Through this ordeal, we have discovered that much of what we take for granted about American democracy and a healthy democratic politics is grounded not just within the text and structure of the Constitution of the United States. Even more important, it emerges from our willingness as members and citizens of a great democracy to abide by and hold others to norms of fair democratic competition, to act toward one another in good faith, and commit to the principle of good governance for the common good. No norm, however, is more vital to a democratic society than the peaceful transfer of power. Consent of the governed becomes impossible to obtain once the threat of force and violence, and not votes and elections, becomes the means by which we seek to resolve our political differences. And no norm imposes greater burdens on our democratic leaders than this one. It requires not just that powerful, ambitious, and proud individuals running for office or holding office freely and willingly stand aside should they be voted out of power, but that they also take active steps to affirm their adherence to the democratic institutions and principles, consent of the governed, free and fair elections, the rule of law, and of course, the peaceful transfer of power that have nonetheless led to their defeat. It is the peaceful transfer of power, this most critical of all democratic norms, that was shattered in the aftermath of this election. It is important to note, moreover, that this norm would have been shattered even had the mob not stormed the Capitol that day. It is not the violence itself that is at issue here, but rather the attempt to use or threaten violence to make congressmen and congresswomen fear for their own personal safety for doing nothing more than the faithful performance of their constitutional duties. That is key. To help us think about the challenges posed by this election's non-peaceful transfer of power, the implications it raises for our future as a democratic people, and the alternatives that we might face in rebuilding a healthy democratic system and civic society, I am delighted to welcome our five panelists this evening. Paul Brown, class of '86, is founding director of the Civic Innovation Center and executive director of special initiatives at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. He is a former government relations executive and worked for many years in various capacities for the Senate Democratic leadership. Jim Caesar, class of '67, and the recipient of an honorary degree in 2002, is a professor of politics at the University of Virginia and a visiting fellow at the Simon Center for American Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Larry James is general counsel of the National Fraternal Order of Police and board member of Kenyon College. Courtney Keeley, class of 1989, is senior political correspondent and former foreign correspondent for various television news outlets, including several years reporting from conflict regions in the Middle East. And finally, Cully Stimson, class of 1986, is a senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation. He has also served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense under Secretaries Donald Rumsfeld and Robert Gates, an Assistant United States Attorney in the District of Columbia, and has been a senior advisor to 2 presidential candidates, as well as a 27-year veteran of the United States Navy. Our panel this evening will converse for around 40 minutes and then take questions from the audience for another 40 to 45 minutes. You may post your questions in the chat accompanying the YouTube stream. We ask too that participants in the chat please identify themselves by their real names, as this is a way of helping to maintain a constructive and civic dialogue. We will try to answer as many of your questions as possible, but may not take them in the order in which they are posted as a way of maintaining the flow of conversation. Please note too that our intention is not a partisan debate or the scoring of partisan points, but we strive instead for a constructive, probing, and civic discussion that seeks greater understanding about the consequential forces at play in American democracy at this time. Our hope is that we all come away knowing more about this topic. And finally, please remember too, that tonight's topic is one of special gravity and personally touches many members of the Kenyan community. Congresswoman Lizzie Fletcher, class of 1997, was present in the House chamber when the Capitol was attacked. One of my former advisees was covering the Capitol that day and was attacked for being a journalist. From our panel, Courtney Keeley covered the day's events live from the Senate Rotunda in the Russell Building and witnessed the storming there. While Paul Brown's daughter was a chamber assistant at the Capitol and was on the Senate floor when she was evacuated to a safe location. Tonight's discussion is one of special gravity because it goes to the heart of what it means to live in a civil society where we can be free from the threat of one another. And so please pursue the discussion in a way that furthers that end. Thank you. What I would like to do, where I'd like to start the panel this evening is really in thinking about how to think about what we've witnessed. Because often when we talk about American politics, it's almost like muscle memory. We immediately revert to what I'll call a partisan frame of reference, where we think about politics as Republicans on one side, Democrats on other, and we know what their positions are and what they, what they're trying to do. And it's important to be a little bit self-conscious about this because the frames of reference that we use are actually very powerful because they help us determine what facts of the matter are relevant. We use them to impute motives to the actors and the actions that they undertake, to construct causal narratives about what we see, and ultimately to make moral judgments about what people are doing. But the problem is that every time we resort to a frame of reference, we're always flattening the world in some way. No frame of reference perfectly captures the reality that we occupy. And so the question is, especially when we're in extraordinary times, is what frame of reference should we be using to think about where we are now? And it's not clear to me that a sort of what I'll call the default frame of reference for talking about American politics, liberals and Democrats on one side, conservatives and Republicans on the other, necessarily helps us very much in the events since the 2020 election took place, in part because it doesn't capture the intense pressure that we saw, for example, the president put on the vice president as he sought to perform his constitutional duties in counting the electoral college votes. It doesn't capture the warning of Senate Majority Leader McConnell to his own colleagues to abandon efforts to overturn the election because, as McConnell put it, mere allegations from the losing side would cause our democracy to enter a death spiral, or the chance of hang Mike Pence that you heard in the mob, or even the bipartisan vote that we saw yesterday to impeach the president in the House. And so my very first question to the panel is this, and it's really a very simple one. How should we think about the events that we saw? What frame of reference should we use? Is it just partisan politics or is something else at play? And if something else is at play, what is it that we should be focusing on in thinking about where we are and in trying to understand how to get to a better place? And I don't know who wants to take the lead. I'll let Courtney, I'll let you just start us off.
Sure. Why not? Thank you again, David, for doing this. It's really important. I'm really grateful that we're getting to discuss this in the Kenyan community, which is dear to my heart. I would take it right out of partisan. As a journalist, I would say the first thing you do is silence the press. So what President Trump did with fake news is to credit the press so effectively over 5 years that it was completely fractionalized and taking different sides, far left, far right. And I've heard that just from even the networks, NBC News. Somebody told me in Missouri over Christmas that, of course, NBC News didn't tell the truth. So if you can't get the truth, where do you get it? And then you add on the power of social media and finding your own group, whether that group is just somebody that amplifies your own beliefs. And then when you have a president who breaks the chain of command, I think the most important thing that happened pre this insurrection was when you had 10 living defense secretaries put an op-ed into the Washington Post and basically signal to every member of the armed forces dating back to at least the Vietnam War, because Dick Cheney had been in the federal government in the late 60s. And that was completely nonpartisan. It was set up and everyone was on board. And that was an absolute, I don't think people really understand how effectively the military stands as one, regardless of who the commander-in-chief is. So that to me gives me chills to think that that many defense secretaries on all different, levels of different wars and good and bad all stood together on that. And then obviously Liz Cheney, his daughter, now stood on the side of impeachment. So you can look to a lot of Republicans that might not have looked to be vocal who did the right thing. And then on the day when I was in the Russell Rotunda, it did not get overrun. It was terrifying for the moment, but because I have war zone training of over 15 years, I could read the tactical things that were going on. My first thought of being in the Black Lives Matter protests was they don't want to look up-armed like they did in Ferguson. They don't want to look like this kind of guerrilla militia on the ground at all anymore. So maybe that was the reason. Now I know is that President Trump had a personal hostility towards the mayor of DC and wouldn't give her what she needed. Now I know that the acting Secretary of Defense was in cahoots with President Trump in terms of not letting the Maryland governor send in the National Guard, which he quickly mobilized and had to wait for several hours. Also, the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security did not issue any kind of intelligence briefings, even though the NYPD, which is probably has a better counterterrorism unit than most countries, had already started warning. So between monitoring groups like the Oath Keepers on the walkie-talkies, knowing that the Proud Boys were coming, knowing that they would go to the Capitol, I thought there would be small groups of very dangerous people that I didn't want to be on the ground for. But when I heard in my ear, I was covering it, looking in front of a camera when President Trump said, go to the Capitol. And it was like a holy mother of God moment. God help us. But at no point was it, in my mind, necessarily partisan, because soon after that, I was reading the statement, the letter that Vice President Pence made sure to say he gave it was never in his authorization as a lover of the Constitution or in American history to overturn this. So I would be very careful not to immediately throw this into partisan, because if you understand the way things have to happen in DC, it was the Secretary of Defense that had to allow the National Guard in, and he didn't.
Okay, so well, you raise a good question. So you're saying, and actually, I think very powerfully, look, it's not a partisan moment. So that then raises the question, what kind of moment is it? How should we be thinking about this? What should we be using to sort of set a framework by which we can begin to make sense of what we see? And I'll go to anyone who wants to come next. Jim, you're actually right next to Courtney on my screen, so I'm just going to go to you.
Well, begin by saying that thank you, by the way, for the invitation and chance to be here. I think if you go back to after the election, you see Trump pretty much going to his own tune, and going into this vote. Forget about the storming the Capitol for a minute. Going into this vote, very few members of the Senate on the Republican side were going to raise an objection to Biden's presidency. There were 3 or 4, strange group, to be sure, including Ted Cruz and others. But most Republicans were not in favor of raising issues, not even theoretically raising issues. And of course, issues had been raised by the Democrats in previous elections. This is not unusual to raise issues, but they stood. And in the House, a large group of members of the Republican Party were going to raise issues, but it was about half, a little under half. So I don't think you can look at this completely in partisan terms. At this point, you could say the old original starting point of Donald Trump, that he was sort of the disruptor, the lone disruptor, as he came into the convention in 2016 and whatnot, was replicated. But the other part of this, of course, is that Trump had a very large support among the popular base of the Republican Party, at least for his claims, not to storm the Capitol, mind you, but for his claims. So that did lend a partisan edge to it. And of course, everything changed with the storming of the Capitol itself. Afterwards, the point we are now, we're back to a more partisan setting, not a completely unified one. There were 11 Republicans or so that voted for impeachment, but still it was a pretty partisan vote. And if you listen to the debate on the floor, most of the Republicans were opposed to impeachment for a variety of different reasons, and all of the Democrats were in favor of it. So that brought back the partisan themes, and I think it's turning to a more partisan considerations, of which the impeachment is one example.
Okay, yeah, Paul, would you like to enter in here?
Yeah, sure. And I'll join in thanking you, David, for this and for the series that you've done this year, last fall. I can't help but think that, you've got to think of it in partisan terms, in the sense that for a number of years leading up to this, had a unified group of Republican senators in particular, or members of the House, stood up to Donald Trump and said something that his behavior was unacceptable, you might have prevented some of the lead up to this. But I don't think that the members of Congress who were involved, who were on the Hill at the time, this is not something that they wanted. And this is a shameful moment for a lot of people, a lot of members of the Republican Party. But the fractures in our country are not simply partisan. They're regional, they're racial, they're based on class, they're based on educational level. There's a lot of things that have been happening in the last few years which are scrambling the traditional partisan equations. I started working on Capitol Hill in the early 1990s, and it was a very, very, very different scene. I don't recognize the Capitol that I see now. I don't recognize the political climate from that in contrast to that era. It's a very different era. And one thing I have to say about our training in liberal arts is that your question, I was thinking in terms of frames. That's a political science question. I look at Donald Trump and think of it in terms of like Shakespeare and King Lear or Richard III. I mean, you have to expand your imagination to think about Donald Trump, because he's not outside. I mean, he is a totalitarian. He's an autocrat. But there's so many things about this administration that have been Shakespearean in my mind. So, it's a. And I also, one other thing I'd say is that, in the past, you've always had extremes of either party. And the party apparatus and the administration have been able to contain that. In this case, we have a president who is, in some ways, a lot more extreme than a lot of the members on the Hill, including people like Mitch McConnell. And they've been at a loss for how to deal with that. And they can't contain that, especially when he has multiple millions of Twitter followers who can be unleashed on those individual members at any time. It's interesting to see what's happened since he was banned from Twitter and other social media platforms. He's voiceless at this point, but members have been put in a tough spot, but they also have not stepped up to the occasion and risen to the occasion, I think, until fairly recently.
Okay, Larry, do you have anything to add to what we've put on the table so far?
Yeah, my observation, and I'm looking prospectively, is we had a colossal failure of leadership all the way around. I think when you get into the debate about partisanship and politics, we forget what leadership looks like. We forget the Mandelas, we forget the Dr. Kings, we forget the Thurgood Marshall. So the way I look at it, I always say there's no partisan way to pick up the garbage, to put out the fire, to arrest the crooks. Law enforcement, for the most part, and absolutely the military, has its own way of approaching unrest consistently. And when I say a colossal failure of leadership, the intelligence was there. There was a debate, I think someone said earlier, that they didn't want to revisit Portland, or they didn't want to revisit Lafayette Park. And so you get in this political fringe fear about how do you consistently prepare for unrest, and how do you have your safety forces prepared in responding to that. We've had personalities in the history of American politics, Huey Long, George Wallace. We've had these fringe personalities and character. Nothing like a Donald Trump and his ability to control a party or to generate 70 million votes to convince folks. The question for the political arena is, where has leadership gone? A leadership that's credible, that's embraced the disagreement, the fraction, and where's the healing's going to take place? And I think when we look at it, and we looked at the primary of how Donald Trump got there, and then you look at Joe Biden's primary, Bernie to Elizabeth, and people, there is no middle ground. There is no middle candidate. So in the press, for all of its doing, are you a Fox? Are you MSNBC? Are you CNN? And people get tired. They get tone deaf. So where do we turn? Where do we turn for reason? Where do we turn for structure? And I think that's the challenge moving forward, is to find those candidates. Like I said, I come out of that Thurgood Marshall group, the John Lewis, where irrespective of what your opposition and what you're fighting against, you never lose that moral high ground in that center, irrespective.
Okay. And Cully, I'll let you chime in, and then I want to come back with a follow-up.
Well, first, thanks, Dave, for having me, and thanks to President Decatur for creating an environment at Kenyon where they can have lively debate with a variety of opinions, and people can go out for a drink afterwards and agree to disagree. And my comments are not reflective of the Department of Defense or Navy, where I still serve, or Heritage, or just in my own personal capacity. I'm not going to repeat anything that my colleagues have said, because I tend to agree with a lot of what everyone said and have similar concerns. The way I look at this, to add to the conversation, Dave, is about norms. We have seen a evisceration of norms from the time President Trump entered the race, through his primary race, through not only what Courtney said, the treatment of the media, the treatment of their candidates. But then when he became president, his obsessive tweeting, his ad hominem attacks of people. I disagreed with some of the policies of previous presidents, and I agreed with some of them. But I never expected to see a president call people names in a childish way that this president has. It turned off a lot of people, including Republicans. The question that begs itself, that which we've teased up, is why did people keep going along with him when they are in the same party? And I think the simple answer is power is temporary. And to Paul's point about how Trump is sort of a Shakespearean character, I'm reminded of the old line Fred Turner, my English professor, or Judy Smith, my English professor, taught me from Othello, which is greed is that green-eyed monster that doth mock the meat it feeds upon. We've seen a mockery of the norms throughout these 4 years. And, Jack Goldsmith, who's a professor of law at Harvard Law School, and who was in the Office of Legal Counsel for some time during the Bush administration when I was there early on, he's written a book called After Trump, which is really worth the read. Because it talks about the various things that we should consider going forward from either a legislative or an executive branch perspective one of which is requiring candidates for president to have to release their tax forms. I mean, the list goes on, and we're all aware of the list of things that were norm busting, but I think that, obviously, I agree with everybody that what happened at the Capitol was disgusting, despicable, but I think the constitutional crisis is over. I really do, because the Electoral College worked, the votes were counted, we've moved past that. Now, I have grave concerns about what may happen between now and the inauguration, and maybe a little bit after the inauguration, especially outside DC, since there are a lot of troops in DC. I worry about soft targets in other state capitals. But I think the constitutional crisis is over. And I think it also shows that the strength of our constitutional fabric, however stretched and pushed and challenged, is still quite strong and robust.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. All right. I want to pick up on a couple of, well, actually several threads that have been sort of dropped like, sort of breadcrumbs throughout the conversation so far. And I'm going to start first with one of the things that Larry said, which is that, partly this is a, sort of an, we've seen an absence of leadership in American politics, which struck me as really interesting, because if you listen to many of Trump's supporters, and especially many of his most fervent supporters, this is what they see in Trump. They see him as a strong leader. And so, I think that there may be something there, and I want to throw that out. Another aspect of this, and this goes to Paul's, sort of, nice, sort of claim to, I don't know, have the literary superiority over me, that this is Shakespearean. It has nothing to do with frames of reference. It really goes in some sense to the nature of the leadership that Trump is offering. And in particular, and Cully, I'll come back to you, it's a kind of leadership which really derives from its ability to throw off constraints. And so he's, is it, one way of thinking about this, and I just want to throw this out to see what you think, are we, is sort of what we're seeing here really an exercise of leadership on the basis not of what we could think of as this institutional power, but a kind of moral power that his followers have vested him with. And so whatever then becomes good for the presidency, is good for his followers and vice versa. And that means that whenever institutional constraints stand in the way of what the president or his followers think is right or just, that those institutional constraints come under severe pressure and often fall, whether they're, sort of what we could call democratic norms or even constitutional processes. And so I'm going to throw that out there. I don't know if anyone would like to pick up on that thread. Larry, you're laughing.
I'll take a stab at it. It'd be interesting because there was a sizable percentage of Trump voters that had voted for Obama. And how did we so quickly go from that classy elegance to that dogmatic, autocratic elected official? And, when we look back at the race between Trump and Clinton, and we begin to characterize people as that basket of deplorables, and you lose them. And I would ask each and every one of us here tonight who know a number of Trump voters, who are our friends, who are well-educated, rational, and we can't figure out why are they following this person. And I think too many of us stopped asking that question, and the communication became a finger pointing. And I think we lost the dialogue and we just drifted apart. And so it made it easy for him to amass, even this last time, 70 million votes. How did we get there? How did we lose those voters?
All right. Courtney, you would like to come in?
Well, I wanted to say, Larry, the way I started my Wednesday morning was in an Uber on the phone with my brother, who is ecstatic with the wins in Georgia. He's in Atlanta. And, I had the last thing I'd covered in Atlanta was the Stacey Abrams race. And she had basically got the voters out. And I had been at Ebenezer when Pastor Warnock gave me permission to film, and John Lewis was dancing there to rally supporters. And then she got people to vote. So there was there's this undercurrent that is racism underneath all of this in terms of populism and racism. And I think really a lot of it's not in my backyard. So you see Georgia as becoming this incredibly important state that Trump lost and could not get over losing. I mean, Trump lost 62 lawsuits and the Supreme Court refused to listen to him. At one point, Biden said, you know, I won, and I won again, because he had so many lawsuits. That started the morning off. So you have a pastor steeped in the right teachings from Ebenezer, becoming the first Black senator in Georgia's history that morning, and then it devolving into what is a complete white supremacist, violent insurrection that believe that the president is being unfairly treated and there's some sort of something wrong. And I think we'd get it wrong if we didn't talk about the demographic shift, and that a lot of people, if we didn't, you know, a lot of people would have voted for Trump merely on economy. They don't want their healthcare changed. If we take away all of the big drama and we go back to why people vote, it's always not in my backyard. So if you're not, the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI did release detailed briefings on Portland. They did approach Black Lives Matter protests differently than they approached this. It's because the president sees them as completely different things. I moved from a much more mixed, traditionally Black neighborhood this summer because there the poverty's gotten so bad and the violence has spiked. But I don't want to say that because I don't want to lend credence to somehow President Trump saying there's anarchy in the streets. It's an economic equation of people being desperate. So there's so much of undercurrents right now: pandemic, unemployment, crime rising. And he capitalized that with his supporters every time and took it into an us and them and Antifa. They're against the police. He kept breaking down these different moral fibers. But a lot of people just voted from their pocketbook, and he probably could have won if the economy hadn't gone off a cliff. One of my friends from college, my roommate at Kenyon, her daughter is like I'm her auntie. And she asked her friends, her young female friends, why they were voting for Trump, even though they knew he was a bad guy. And they said, my dad's voting for them, or, he hasn't done anything wrong with us. And she used me as an example because, full disclosure, I used to work for Fox News. And she said, well, my auntie who lives in, used to work she told me Roger Ailes didn't do anything to her and she was okay working there. But it doesn't mean he didn't do so many things to other women. So, and like as a 23-year-old, she had gotten that message I was so grateful for, of you don't have to vote for this guy just because he hasn't done anything to you. But I think a lot of people were so untouched by that. And that's where it went partisan. It was like, but I'm a Republican. I vote for, they're going to raise my taxes. Really basic misinformation. And that's where it's not even evil. That's where it's just benign ignorance or just political party fallback.
Okay. Jim?
Yeah, well, I mean, if it's possible to put yourself in a position, let's say before the election, before Trump went off the cliff, and look back, so that, in a way, forget the last couple months and go back to that point. A strong case can be made for the Trump's presidency. Obviously, he came in as a disruptor. He disrupted the Republican Party. Is there something that could be said for a disruptor, for its negative parts and its positive parts? And I think in the view of many Republicans who were first very skittish of him and came around, it wasn't just that he bludgeoned them, it's that they came to appreciate in some ways what he was doing. And he had a vast following before that. So if it would be possible in this group, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, you would have to look at the Trump presidency pre-mob, pre-election, and ask, could it be defended in many ways? And in many ways, I believe it could be defended as in some ways a successful, though very odd presidency, disruptive of norms, but then intended to disrupt norms, and so on and so forth. We wouldn't have the same view of him that we have now, which is now going to be used, and rightfully so, because it happened. You can't take that back. But it's going to be used to taint the entire presidency of Trump, to see the presidency entirely through the lens of this action, which again is legitimate because it was an action that he inspired. But it doesn't negate this earlier question of how Trump was seen. So the other point to keep in mind is that in every election, it's a choice between two sides. And you go back to 2016, and neither side was very desirable in my view. So the question is not whether anyone is to be condemned or not to be condemned, but how do they compare to the other side? And the other side was very problematic, including a side which denied the legitimacy of his election, still does, by Hillary Clinton, and which set in motion a plot by the parts of the FBI to undermine and get him impeached even before he got going. So there's lots to be said on both sides. And that would be another way to look at this, is to try and see things from a perspective of 2 months in arrears.
Yeah, and actually, Jim, one of the most, I don't know if you saw our very first panel in this series all the way back in September. There was a fascinating exchange between two conservative members of the panel. And one person made the argument, look, Trump has done everything that conservatives value. And the other person, and this gets to Larry's point, said, yes, but character matters. And for me, that's non-negotiable. And so, that character, you're absolutely right that for many Republicans, he's really delivered, but that character matter, I think, is just sort of hanging out there. And, if we could overlook that, then we would have a completely different view, I think, of his presidency. But unfortunately, as we all know, it forced itself to the fore. Cully, and then I want to go to Paul.
Yeah, let me just jump in quickly. I think that there are, and I'm a Republican who has run a Democrat's campaign, by the way, for office. And I have a lot of Democrats who are friends like Paul and in my family. And I focus on policy, not politics. But I know a lot of Republicans, and I think the internecine war that will be going forward into the Republican Party, and there are always these circular firing squads after your party loses. There's factions, and Paul and I could debate that ad nauseum, but and then there's a coming together because there has to be, for political expediency purposes, to rally around some small number of candidates and then ultimately a nominee. But what's happened in the Republican circle and then the conservatives, which are part of Republicans, is that's exactly right. You have people who are sort of hold your nose Trumpers. They voted for them because they didn't like Hillary more. You have others who are MAGA people who wear the hat and go to the rallies and wave the flag. You have others who are more circumspect and wanted regulatory relief, who wanted constitutionalists appointed to the courts, who wanted to see the Congressional Review Act used to strip back acts that weren't presented properly to Congress, who want to see a more robust exchange and better trade deals, who want to see any number of things, including not getting into more wars, which Trump didn't do. So they take a more pragmatic approach. And so what I'm seeing now in my ecosystem of friends, left, right, and center, but especially on the slightly right to right side, is that there is a big finger pointing and fight going on. There's the I told you so crowd, which is sort of the Lincoln Project people. There's the MAGA people saying, if only it wasn't for voter fraud, if only it wasn't for the pandemic that allowed the state governors and the state courts allowing the rules to change, we would have won. But I'm reminded, and all of us are old enough to remember this, of the allegations of voter fraud in 2000. I'm reminded of the allegations of voter fraud in 2004. James pointed out the allegation that Russia interfered to the benefit of Trump in 2016, and of course our alum Rutherford B. Hayes was engaged. There was a big allegation of voter fraud in 76. Yeah, which resulted in the compromise in 1877. So allegations of voter fraud are not uncommon in presidential elections. And what has happened to date is that once the election is over and the person finally concedes, that people tend to pitter away and stop making those fraud claims. Now, Jim makes a good point. I think some Democrats have never conceded that Trump won legitimately in 2016. And I think that there will be some never Trumpers who will never say that the president really lost, that he actually won. And we'll see how long their argument has legs.
Okay, Paul.
I've been thinking about the whole idea of American exceptionalism in this debate and discussion, and sort of the two worldviews. And this is certainly, everyone who voted for Trump doesn't think like Trump. There are a lot of people who held their nose and voted for him because of the strong economy. And there are a lot of people in the Democratic Party who just hated Trump for who he is. But the worldview that Trump represented, America first, make America great again, people were willing to allow the destruction of norms. And it was all about the projection of American power, economic power, and military power. And it's what that means to be an American and a certain view of what an American looks like. I think on the other side, and I think Courtney and Cully's points about the fact that our system held, is that the other view of American exceptionalism is that what makes us exceptional is our strong free press. It's our that we are a nation of laws, and that we have had peaceful transitions. And that's what makes it so remarkable. And that was what was so reprehensible to a bipartisan group of former defense secretaries who were willing to stand up and say, this is wrong. And there were a lot of other people in the Republican Party who were willing to stand up and say this is wrong, because what makes it America exceptional is our system and it's our norms. And I have some faith that those norms, since they have survived and people did see the threat to those, that hopefully we'll be reverting back to some of those norms. And I think the tone that President-elect Biden has set is trying to get back to that. And I think there's some hope in that. But it was a very strong part of Donald Trump's appeal, was that he was kind of raised the middle finger to a lot of the things that Washington has stood for in the past. Some of it not great, but people wanted that destruction. But I think we have to step back from the abyss and say, we can go too far, and that's what's happened.
Yeah, and it strikes me too that when you're, sort of your brand is pure disruption, that there is no natural stopping point. There's no natural point to say, yes, now I concede the election, because, right, it's you're overthrowing whatever constraint you next feel. And so there is this sense to me that, there was a dynamic here that was partly driven, I think, Paul, as you pointed out, his personality, but also the appeal of the kind of politics and the kind of leadership, as Larry alluded to, that he could exercise. But I'd like us to return a little bit to, we've done a lot of time, and often this happens, right? We try and think, okay, how did we get here? Because people just generally naturally talk in narratives and in stories. And so, whenever we want to, analyze the present, the first place we look is the past. But I would like to return us briefly to, January 14th, 2021. How serious is the crisis that we're in? I mean, we already have, Cully, you've already, you said, look, I think the system held. Paul, you said, yeah, I think you can put you in that category. The system seems to have held, despite the norm violations and everything else. But I would like to get a fuller picture. Has the system held? Is it just a temporary hold? Are we going to see, sort of further escalations? There are reports that there will be over the weekend, demonstrations in state capitals. So where are we now in this crisis? Where are we now in this transfer? How serious of a harm to the American democracy are we experiencing? Courtney.
It's going to take the woman take the first spot every time. So
you raised your hand.
I know, I keep raising it. Counterterrorism is the big issue right now, domestic terrorism. And I never use the terrorism word lightly. So I do think, and I've been watching all the chatter, that the big issue is not necessarily in a complete lockdown DC. It's killing in the name of somewhere else that keeps me up at night. Timothy McVeigh, a random act of violence, because people have really been believe that have been told by President Trump that they should stop this process by any means necessary. It's been echoed over and over. So friends of mine, we've all covered, been in lockdowns for years in lots of countries, many countries like Iraq, are very worried about the next several days. And it had me twitchy since January. It still has me very twitchy. I can hear helicopters. It's not hard to remember the helicopters flying over Baghdad. So that is an immediate fear that people have to really take care. But then also, as soon as the government starts the transition, they need all of that structure in place so that the intelligence agencies really start talking to themselves again. And then I was also telling my brother, in terms of having covered everything from Hezbollah to Hamas, up front, and to Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which inevitably led to ISIS later on, that if you want to help deprogram your people, feed and water them, get them medical care, get them education, get them help. So if soon-to-be President Biden and co. are able to get the government functioning again on that level, regardless of either, there'll also be that level of can they get out and start helping the people most in need in a non-ideological level. And there's going to have to be like literal counter-programmers that have dealt with extremism, as well as helping any kind of community.
Larry, would you like to jump in here?
Yeah, I think we'll get back to norm. It may take us another year into the administration, but look, what I really was impressed with is the election that took place in Georgia. And those Republican state office holders stood up to Trump. Our governor here in Ohio stood up to Trump. We've had a number of Republican governors around the country who have actually done that. So when we look at the state of government, the economics of government, that is the thing, our educational system, and obviously something dear to my heart with my clients, and that is the relation of law enforcement, particularly to the urban area. And that fracture is as huge and is as dangerous as anything. And we have, irrespective of our past, irrespective of fault, how are we going to bridge that gap? I also happen to have been safety director. I prosecuted cops for internal affairs. So I've been 360. And I've been general counsel since 2001, and we've tried to get these policies which you bridge that. Is the glass half empty, half full, or just too damn big? So when you're looking at the world, but I look at some of the core issues, our educational system, our economic system, financing, tax, particularly during this pandemic. We have some other issues that are going to force people back to the middle beyond Trump. And if we don't get our eyes on the prize, we're going to be fighting ghosts.
Okay, Cully?
So Dave, I know you like folks to mix it up a little, so I'm going to respectfully disagree with Courtney. I've actually been in charge of detainee affairs in the Bush administration and been in the interrogation booth with terrorists, and was in part in charge of the operation to bring the CIA detainees to Guantanamo. So I've seen a lot of terrorists, including Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, face to face. I've also been a prosecutor and defense attorney. The knuckleheads and criminals and jerks who stormed the Capitol, we can call them domestic terrorists. Congress has defined domestic terrorism as statute, but they haven't made it a standalone offense. What they did is commit crimes, just like the people in this summer who committed crimes all around the country and attacked police officers. It's despicable, whoever does it. And so I don't worry that I did say earlier that I am concerned about the safety and some number of these idiots rising up between now and probably a week or two, maybe 2 or 3 weeks after the election, on soft targets or in state capitals. But they can be dealt with, and they will be caught. They will be prosecuted by my old office, the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. Read some of the complaints which are online on Lawfare blog, where they issue the criminal complaints and they published it in the indictments. It's disturbing, very disturbing what they did. But these are criminals. And when you get into the business, and I think we're going to see this, of trying to codify and criminalize domestic terrorism as a crime, a standalone crime, and I can tell you this as almost a 30-year lawyer, you're going to get into some a real briar patch, because I am absolutely convinced that the law is more than sufficient at the state and federal level to cover the conduct that they engaged in without running down the briar patch of trying to label it domestic terrorism. One person's domestic terrorist is not another person's domestic terrorist. And I think that if we prosecute them to the extent of the law, put them in jail for long periods of time for whatever they did wrong, it is going to dissuade anyone else from engaging in this type of behavior.
Yeah, Paul.
Dave, I'm going to respectfully disagree with Cully on that, because I won't argue the law, but I will argue that it's important to call what they did terrorism, because I think it was the failure of imagination to think that a group who was in town to listen to the president of the United States speak about the elections, then going to the Capitol and doing what they did with the purpose of stopping our constitutional system and threatening harm to members of Congress. To me, that's terrorism. And nobody, the Capitol Police and other law enforcement couldn't imagine that happening. I think it was a failure of imagination in a lot of ways, like 9/11 was.
Well, I agree with that, but I don't understand how you're different.
Yeah, well,
because it is terrorism, what they did.
I think it's, you're falling back on the legal definition. What I'm saying is that it's important for people to say that these aren't just common criminals. And I also think about sort of the banality of evil when I think about the people who did this. You hear about CEOs, a former, an Olympic swimmer, cops, firemen. These are everyday Americans. They don't look, they're not Al-Qaeda. They don't look like an other. They look like us. And they stormed our citadel of democracy with the intent to harm people. And I think about it personally in terms of what my daughter was going through, and that there were people who she would otherwise look to for in a trustworthy position, who were bent on destruction and violence. And I think that's very important, that we have to say these are not common criminals.
Hey, Paul, this is Larry. I just want to say, when you say they look like us, some of us.
Absolutely. I should say they look like me.
Okay.
All right, Courtney, I'll let you come back in.
I'll keep it really brief, but I don't think we should, I think that we should also acknowledge the clown car of people that were there. So, Cully, I'm not taking a group of people like I wouldn't take a protest in Beirut and say everybody in the protest was a terrorist, even if Hezbollah was in the audience. So I'm also quite good at reading the crowd, and it took days to see who was really in that crowd. So there were people that just walked over there because they liked the president. There were people that stood behind velvet ropes, and there were people in there with zip ties that were ready to execute people because they thought President Trump needed them to execute Pelosi or Pence. So that's when I finally caved to the terrorism word. However, I'd also say that Guantanamo Bay has its terrible grays. And, it was like, okay, so is this maybe what they realized what happened in Benghazi? It's there. You have the version of the law. I have the version of the vagaries of being in all these different places and sort of what actually constitutes it. Does it constitute because international law calls you a terrorist? Who's the definition? I hate the word because it's overused, and I'm an English major. So, and it's always, there is often banality of evil. My only point was, a lot of people that join terrorism groups, if you want to say Hezbollah is a designated terrorism group, the T word, They do it because they need community. They do it because they don't have a purpose. They do it because they need a cause. And if you can go to those roots, not the evil people, but the people that don't have any other recourse. And I'm talking about rural poverty, all sorts of reasons that got people riled up.
All right, well, let me just make one brief comment, and then I want to shift gears slightly, and that is on the terrorism issue. I teach terrorism at Kenyon. Actually, Cully has been in my seminar before. And sort of the definition of terrorism, it's one of those places where it's just a morass. And in my seminar, we use an analytical definition, which is just simply the use of violence for political purposes by non-state actors to subvert existing authority. Right, that anytime someone who is not acting under the authority of law uses violence to subvert the authority that is in place, we can consider that a form of terrorism. Now, how that gets defined legally is a different question, because you have different, as you prosecute someone, there are different interests that come into play. But at least analytically, I think that we can say, look, a lot of the people, in terms of an analytical definition of terrorism, we're really trying to subvert the American constitutional form of government by using violence to impede with a constitutional mandate of the Congress to count the votes and name the successor president. Jim, I want to come back to you, and I want to shift gears slightly, if that's okay.
Go right ahead.
And that is we've already heard some hints from different places in the audience, in the panel, about how we might begin to work past where we are right now. And so I would like to shift our gaze a little bit to the future. What are those things that we can do to rebuild the norms? And what do you see are the most important things that we can start to do to rebuild the norms that undergird American democracy, that allow us to see other people not as others, but really as members of this same sort of common endeavor? And in particular, and I know this is a big question, what role do our political elites play or should they play in this process? So I'll hand it over to you.
Quite a question. I'm not sure that what will happen. I mean, it's like guessing. We don't know what the future holds. I don't, in my observations now of the large parts of the Democratic Party, I don't see this as happening in the future. I see them as using the current situation to solidify the grip that they have on America and make it much stronger, so that their primary end will be a partisan end. They in their view, this is an end for the good. I'm not taking away their view of what they think is correct, but they want to see the part that it was involved in this takeover and everything else they imagine connected with it, this attack on the Congress, and everyone's associated with it. They want that stomped out in any way possible, and that involves using elements of law, culture, especially culture. By culture, I mean using institutions like the mass technology, the universities and whatnot to stamp out this opposition. That's their definition and understanding of what would make the United States normal and correct. So this is going to be met to some degree, if this is the direction we go in, this is going to be met to some degree by opposition from that force. Of course, it all depends on what the president does as well. To what extent is the president going to take a stand on this and present himself as one way or another? That's a complete unknown. He hasn't said anything for 3 months that gives you much indication. He talks about a lot of practical things, but we don't know where he's going to be on these bigger issues. So that's what I see, continuing problems. But continuing problems to me doesn't mean the end of the world. It just is a realistic statement of where I think we're going. And I take this from listening to what the Democrats have been saying for the last 4 years, what they'll continue to say. And now they're going to say it on a strengthened basis. Finally,
okay,
yeah.
Paul, I'm going to come to you, since you're the person most directly on this panel, most directly sort of familiar with Democratic politics.
Yeah, well, I have to say, I'll speak from the perspective of my former professions, and then I'll say a little bit about my current profession. And former professions as a Hill staffer and a lobbyist that I think one of the way outs is to get back to some of the norms of deliberative government and supporting institutionalists in Congress. People, even though I disagree with a lot of what Mitch McConnell says, I think he's an institutionalist. Respect process norms, get back to relationships across the aisle. I think that one of the things that it's gotten overlooked with the last week with the Georgia elections is that you have a 50-50 Senate. And the last time we had that, we had basically a power sharing agreement between the Republicans and the Democrats in the Senate. And you're going to have some negotiations along those lines because otherwise you can have a morass. They will have to come to some kind of agreement basically to share power, even though Chuck Schumer will be majority leader. So I think there's hope in that possibility because you're not going to be able to ram things through in a very evenly divided Senate. So I think also the long-standing relationship between Mitch McConnell and Joe Biden is a positive. Mitch McConnell, I think, had to be a little bit circumspect about reaching out to Biden based on Trump's reactions, but I think in the last week or so, it seems like that has changed. So that's a positive. From my current perspective, current job, I'm involved in a higher education focus on creating a culture of civic engagement and civic education, which means what it means to be a productive citizen of this country. And that's respecting tolerance, diversity of views, pluralism. And I think there's hope in young people in that we can work to that end with this generation of young people because I think they're more engaged. And I think they're more respectful of differences. And but it has to be practiced, it has to be taught, it has to be sustained. That's what my focus is on now, and I see a country kind of ready for that. Having seen this horror show of the last week, that maybe there will be a renewed emphasis on service, on civic engagement, participation, and understanding and respecting the norms of democratic behavior.
Okay, Cully.
For those of you keeping score at home, if you look at 18 USC 2331 subsection 5 subsection 3, it defines domestic terrorism, and it's exactly what we've been talking about, what happened on the Hill: acts dangerous to life that are a violation of criminal laws intended to blah 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 affect the conduct of the government by mass destruction. So clearly what happened was terrorist activity. The fact is that Congress never chose to attach a criminal penalty to it. But back to Paul's comment, which I think is excellent as always, but I want to tie it to Larry's comment about leadership. If we could run the government, people would have confidence because we're agreeing to disagree on certain things. We're agreeing on most things, but we're disagreeing slightly on the edges. Gone are the days of the Tip O'Neill, Ronald Reagan, fight like hell during the day and have a drink together at night. And it requires leadership, patience, and prudence. And so, I'm hopeful because I'm an optimist that given the realities of a 50-50 Senate, given the realities that the president-elect has been a longtime colleague of Senator McConnell, where the power will lie with respect to Senate confirmations, that they'll revert back to norms. But I think, for example, Republicans won't forget the fact that the Democrats filed cloture on virtually every Trump nominee and forced them to burn 30 hours, me included. I was the nominee to be the general counsel to the Department of the Navy and never got a vote. So a lot of Republicans won't forget that. The question is, are they willing to put it aside for the good of the country? And are Democrats willing to get 70% and be satisfied with that for the good of the country? And I think, leadership requires courage. And hopefully that this imbroglio that we've been through, and I hope to God there's no violence between now and, when Trump and Trumpist sail off into the sunset, that people, calmer heads will prevail. The temperature will dial down. Biden is going to be the un-Trump. He's not going to be a dramatic person. He's going to be very understated. He's an elder statesman, so he doesn't have anything that Trump had in terms of pizzazz. And I think that may be the exact right prescription to help the country dial the temperature down a little bit. And then the question is whether because we do have an adversarial partisan system, whether the machinery of both parties can take cues from the top and dial it down and still agree to disagree on policy. That's my glass is half full hope for the country. We'll see how it plays out.
Larry, would you like to come in?
Yeah, this is really interesting from the standpoint that when we look back at the Trump-Clinton race, the black vote didn't show up nearly as much as it did during the Obama days. And then when you move forward, and this time around, the black vote clearly delivered for Joe Biden, and particularly in Georgia, for a lot of the black activists. The question going forward for the Democrat Party is how will it mend? How big will that tent be? How much influence will that black vote have on shaping policies? You have a splinter. We don't know how that's going to manifest itself. We've seen what has happened to the Republican Party. So that's a big question mark. I really do appreciate presidential politics, but for most people, all politics are local. And I come back to those core issues locally in a number of areas. And if government can't address those issues, we won't move forward.
Okay, so one of the concerns that you're raising, and this actually goes back to something that was raised earlier in the panel, is that there, part of the pathway forward has to, on the one hand, be elites that cooperate with one another, and this gets to James's point that not only must they cooperate with one another, but they must cooperate with one another in a competitive partisan setting where they're going to be concerned both about partisan gain, but also national interest. And, and to actually render yourself vulnerable under those conditions requires a great degree of trust in your counterparty on the other side. And so, maybe that's there, maybe that's not. But at the same time, I think one of the other things that you're saying is that, strong government performance, government that works for people, that people see government actually acting in ways that they identify as making their lives better. This was said earlier. I think, Larry, this is key to some of the things that you're saying. If people feel like government is responsive to their interests, then this may also then be one of the ways by which we work our way to a better place, by actually having democracy work. As a professor of political science, one of the things that's really interesting to me now is I have students who, for most of their, what I'll say, sort of political lives, don't really see democracy working or working very well. And so I think, and I think there's an argument that this is partly behind, or one of the reasons behind, the Trump phenomenon, which we're all now grappling with.
Yeah, the other thing I would say, there is this argument, and it came when Obama was elected, post-racial politics or society, which I thought was just insane. And we've seen a resegregation of America economically, racially, educationally. And those are the things, those are those little flashpoints that can also reverberate. What is it? Netflix is coming out with revisiting the story of the Black Panthers. And if you watch that, you could almost change colors between the Trump folks and their fanaticism and the Black Power movement in '68 and on with the Panthers. And I think a lot of folks on the political front are asking those questions. Why are we where we were? Why are we no better than we were in '68?
Mm-hmm. Well, so how do we get out of that? And here's a question that really struck me coming from the chat. Where does the responsibility or the big responsibilities lie? Is it with ordinary citizens as they lead their daily lives and maybe even go into the voting booth? Or does it really reside with our political elites and how they interact with one another and present themselves to us, through the process of the election? Anybody?
I would just say it depends on citizens, and we need better citizens. We need people who are better informed, who can understand and appreciate complexity, and and are willing to accommodate compromise. And I think we have gotten away from that, and people and political figures take advantage of that. And I also think we need to kind of maybe de-emphasize so much attention on what happens in Washington and focus more on, to Larry's point, on effective government at the local level, because that's people just don't pay attention to local government. We're so fixated on watching MSNBC or Fox and the coverage of the drama in Washington that we don't really pay attention to the important work that gets done at the local government level. And just one other thing I would say, just to follow up on what Larry said, we are long overdue for a reckoning on race in this country. It started this summer, and I'm afraid that there was a backlash against that in November, and part of it was based on the protests and the police response to the protests. What happened last week is a direct result of all of that, I think. And we never dealt with the issue of race and slavery in this country. We had Reconstruction, and then we buried it. And then we had Jim Crow, and we've never dealt with that legacy, honestly, in my opinion. And I think President Biden understands that. Our President-elect Biden, I think he's talked about that to some degree. And I think it's important, and particularly given how he got to be president. It wasn't only Georgia, but he was saved by the African-American vote in South Carolina. He would not be president if it weren't for African Americans in South Carolina. I think he owes a special debt. He also has a special affinity. So I'm hopeful that we can look at what happened last week and step back from the abyss again and just say, we have to realize that part of this is our failure to reckon with race in this country. And we need to do a better job and honest discussion about this. And it's not going to be easy, but it's got to happen.
Paul, let me ask you a question. And you say we need a better, more informed citizen. And I agree with you in principle. But when people are in a hole, they don't have the luxury of intellectualizing. They go into their silo trying to preserve, and that's what Trump played off, what breadcrumbs they have. And if we can't address that issue, we can't give a people a luxury to look at someone else's affairs or look at it through a different lens.
Larry, I agree completely. And I think one of the failures of the Democratic Party under Barack Obama was not addressing the issues of rural America, right, and the people who've been left behind. And you go to Maine, rural Maine, where I was a couple of years ago, and you see a Confederate flag. Why is there? What's the historical connection? It's the feeling that they've been left behind, and the rebel flag means something in terms of a sort of middle finger, and it's a cry for help. It's anger. That anger is real. Trump was not the right solution to that, but that doesn't mean that the Democratic Party can ignore that. And I think I've been encouraged from what I've seen in terms of his the outreach they're going to have in rural America with this new DNC chairman, Jamie Harrison from South Carolina, and focusing on the state parties and trying to get things out of Washington. I think there's an understanding that we've got to be better as a party on rural American issues because that's where a lot of this tension came from.
And one last thing, but the common issues and problems between rural America and urban America are mirror images. Mm-hmm. So whatever leader emerges, that understands that. You know, it's kind of like looking at COVID. It started out in the urban areas, it's not coming at us, and then all of a sudden it's killing us. So that's where I'm stuck on the local issues, those real economic pocketbook issues, and I'm looking at leaders who can bridge.
Yep.
Okay, Cully, and then I want to switch gears slightly.
Yeah, let me pick up on two strands of the conversation and try to answer the question you asked in the first place, Dave. One of the strands is and Larry picked up on this and talked about it, and I want to pick up on another aspect, and that is, you know, Paul says local, and I think local starts with the family and the home and ensuring that your kid or kids have a proper understanding of the government and their civic duty as citizens growing into mature citizens. I am concerned about intolerance of ideas in academia, in schools. I see it. I have 4 kids, all in high school or below. I listen to their Zoom classes. There's a lot of intolerance about ideas. I think it's incumbent upon teachers, Dave, you're not one of them, obviously, to encourage a diversity of opinion and not squelch opinion. But I'm seeing that. The person who has this opinion, and he's the only person, is the pariah in the class. And it tends to be somewhat left-leaning. Some would say very left-leaning. And I think that that's unhealthy. And I think as much as I aspire for the Biden-McConnell maturity to turn the temperature down some, there's a lot of learning that needs to be done in terms of prudence and encouraging the diversity of opinion based on facts. The other thing that I think is going to play out also is what we've seen, and I wrote about this in the Wall Street Journal in an op-ed with David Rivkin at the beginning of the pandemic, that governors, because they occupy a unique role and have police power, and the federal government doesn't, exercise for the first time a lot of powers they didn't know they even had under their state constitutions. Some would say they stepped way over their skis. I think some did. But now we've had about 4.5 million doses of the vaccines put in people's arms, but 24 million doses have been delivered to the states. And where's the accountability? What is the failure? Because the governors of these states knew for months that these vaccines were going to be made available to them. They're going to use the standard flu vaccine protocol to inoculate people. And yet you have 20 million doses just sitting on shelves, not getting put into people's arms. That's not a federal government responsibility, but that is a government responsibility, to Larry's point from a while ago. And so, you know, we want a government that works for us. Our local government is the most responsive. And so I think that there's going to be a lot of scrutiny into why that's not working in this broader context of what is the function of the government and what is the people's responsibility within the government.
Okay, all right, well, thank you. And I promised you a slight shift of topic, and so here we go. And that is that, you know, I think that, and it has to do with accountability. You know, one of the things that is, you know, if you think about healing, how do we heal? You know, partly I think that relies on holding people accountable for their actions when they've done things that have led to harm. Because to, you know, sort of look the other way, move past them, really, you know, over the long term, you know, generates, you know, deep resentment. And I think, you know, if you go back and sort of say, hey, what are some of the roots of the problem we're seeing today? And I think, Paul, you alluded to this. Part of the roots actually, I think, lay with the way in which the Obama administration responded to the financial crisis and appeared to be more interested in, you know, sort of shoring up the major actors of the financial system and less concerned about the impact on people's day-to-day lives, especially if they were, you know, for no fault of their own, suddenly underwater on their mortgage and in danger of losing their house. And so I think accountability and holding people accountable is actually very important here. And so who should we hold accountable, especially now that this fundamental norm of democracy, the peaceful transfer of power, has been broken? who should we hold accountable and how should we hold them accountable? And Jim, I'll start with you.
Start with me. Yeah. Maybe you could be a little bit more specific about, you're asking about the president now. We're 6 days or so from changing presidents. So I don't know how you're going to hold them accountable. I don't think impeachment is going to do it. If you went back to the beginning of this process, much as I admired some of the things that President Trump did, you asked this question about the president after this occurred: would the administration that was under him, would they obey him? And it wasn't clear to me that they would. So the executive is like the heart. It always has to beat. And a political system that doesn't have a president that's functioning is a very, very dangerous place. So right after the events of that day, I was convinced that whatever you think of Trump, he couldn't exercise the office of the presidency for the next 2 weeks. And now we're getting closer. Maybe he'll make it through the next 6 days. But I think accountability in the first place is secondary to the necessities of having a working government. And therefore, reluctantly, I came to the conclusion right after that that he should have been removed from office immediately. Not so much that the justice of it, that's your question, Dave. The question, could he exercise the office of the presidency under an emergency situation where his action would be necessary? I'm not sure people were listening to him. Half the offices of the government were falling apart. There really was no presidency there. How long can a nation live without a presidency? Well, I think we'll make it through the next 6 days. I'm a little bit assuaged on that. So that's my feeling on that. There's accountability also at the local level. Everyone is focusing, as they should, on the presidency and what the president did. But what about the accountability, if you want to get it, of all these mayors and several of the governors in running their states? And I'm not talking just about getting COVID shots. I'm talking about what's been happening in Oregon and Washington. These are disgraces, what's happening. You talk about terrorism as if it's only terrorism which happened in Washington. That's the worst case because it's terrorism against the national government. But we've been living with terrorism at the local level for 6 or 7 months now. Day after day, place after place, without it being dealt with in any way, and willfully governors and mayors walking away from the issues that confront them. So are they going to be held accountable? Are voters going to hold them accountable? We'll see.
All right, Courtney, I would like to hear what you have to say.
Well, as a journalist, sometimes I just like to listen. I'm actually now really just keen on hearing what people have to say. Cully, now I'm thinking about, so what will the Senate do, and will there be conviction, and what punishment could they mete out, and when? Because that's the way it's going to go. It's not what I think should happen. I'm just interested in watching how it's going to happen. And I think people are signaling, Mitch McConnell doesn't want to do it as majority leader. Tom Cotton is sort of threading the needle, saying he doesn't think it's constitutional. It's going to hinge on where it should hinge, people's interpretation of the Constitution, which makes me happy. Also, Cully, you talked about being in a classroom and listening to kids shouting over each other. I think that I haven't seen civil discourse or the teaching of it for 20 years, since I started coming home from Beirut and Baghdad and places like that. It was you're blue, you're red, you're wrong, you're right. I mean, I couldn't stand either side. I always say I have like a healthy disrespect of all politicians. That's my job, is to not belong. It's to hear all of this out. But I do believe in this new generation. Dave, we talked about it, Dave, the last time. I feel like the generation that is just that they just started to vote, Paul, your daughter, they are the ones that lived through school shootings, 2 forever wars, and now an insurrection. And I think they understand in this generation that healing doesn't happen automatically because you say, hey, wipe your tears, you're fine now. And I think there'll be a long time healing. And so politicians right now saying, we can't move to the next step in the political process on a federal level because the nation needs to heal. Or Jim, when you're saying, well, this needs to heal, like collectively people are still dying. We have to start, we were still in triage on every level, and that has to be respected, and people should be able to say what they feel, regardless of what their politics are. But no, they're not allowed to, spout racist ideology. I mean, I think there's a line between what's hurtful and racist and what's just political, or what's a dialogue, or what gets you to start thinking about how people are going to get to there. And Gen Z, they're the toughest, the most cynical, the ones that know how to have grown up with all of this. And so they're the ones that I foster and love, because they're the ones that are keeping me on my toes and thinking about what's happening next. And I do think that they're the ones that do foster dialogue better than any other generation. But this is going to be a long process. And I'm hoping that DC becomes the boring political sausage making DC that used to be, that I wasn't based in. I'm looking to see what they're going to do in Syria, foreign policy, USAID, restoring American dignity and restoring people's dignity around the world, where we go out and help. But we also have to be going out and help in kind of like a FDR kind of way, not choosing a politician, but in a in a depression, acknowledging. I do think the recession was never acknowledged the damage that it did. And we have never gotten to the point now. And if we actually acknowledge where we're at now, which is really on our knees as a nation, then we can start rebuilding on a much more partisan level. But I'm definitely more interested in starting to go back out and do the food bank stories and the nurse stories. And I'm really looking forward to getting away from, what's constitutional. I think we kept it together, which was a good thing.
All right. Well, I wanted to sort of just push on an issue here, and that is and it gets back to Paul's earlier comment about race, some of the things that Larry has said. But what about white supremacy? Because there was this sense that partly Trump's support and his dog whistling and the sort of the animus that helped animate the crowd on week ago Wednesday was partly driven by white supremacy and racial animus. Does there have to be some kind of explicit, we've talked, sort of for, the Black community in solving the problem of, or addressing the problem and the inequities created by a history of racism. Do we also need to devote similar attention to the problem of white supremacy and the reaction to a lot of racial politics inside the United States? Paul.
Yeah, I would say yes.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think one of the things about this, what happened last week was there was outcry that there were only 14 arrests that occurred. But I think you're going to see and you already are over the next few weeks, more and more and more of these arrests. And I think we need to know what motivated these people, why they did what they did. We need a better understanding of this. Certainly not everyone who supported Donald Trump is a white supremacist, but everyone who did was willing to look past the fact that he is one. And that says something about our country that we've got to understand what caused that, what motivated people to look beyond his obvious flaws and say it's okay to vote for somebody like him, and then to have this happen as a consequence of the election that he lost, for people to say that we need to take this into our own hands because we're right, and these are there's a lot of stories we need people. It's not simply an issue of economic depravity. I mean, one of the people who was arrested was the CEO of a company, storming the Capitol, threatening members of Congress. There's no justification for that. It's other than it's an act of madness and detachment from reality. And we need to understand what has led people to to that kind of belief system. We have, in order to heal, in order to get past this, we have to understand where this came from.
Okay. Larry, anyone else want to jump in?
You know, I grew up a large part of my early years in Demopolis, Alabama, in the old Jim Crow South. And I told people there's nothing you can throw at me that I haven't seen. And maybe we can learn something from that troubled period of, you know, white supremacy, because it was rooted in the law, either written or constructive, and Black folks live with that. So this is nothing new to us of a certain generation. I struggle and says, who is going to tackle the white supremacy issue, and how are we going to get at it? Again, I think we need to go back in history and understand what changed the South. Not that the North was that much better, but how did Atlanta become Atlanta and the South get to where it was? Because I think what King said is, at the end of the day, we're going to have a hell of a lot more success in the South than we are in the North, because in the South, before the big urban areas, everybody lived together. Mm-hmm. They knew each other. They were forced to interact, not like Boston, not like Chicago. So it's a big puzzlement. And that's something I think, from the law enforcement standpoint, we're struggling with, and we're trying to find the answers that people are at least going to be paused. They're going to pause before they act out on extremist views. But that's a big question mark going forward. And I don't see anyone of our elected officials on the national level that I would have any confidence that are going to bridge that gap and speak to those issues and inspire people.
I don't want to dominate the conversation, but I just want to respond, because Larry, my dad was from Birmingham, Alabama, and my grandmother was from Selma. My father says he was never sure if his father was not a member of the Klan, because he was a man of his time. My grandfather was friends with Bull Connor in Birmingham. My father turned away from that. He went to the University of Alabama, and after graduation never went back. I think he always struggled with the racism in the South, and he turned his life in a different direction. It's going to be white people needing to come to account with this. And I would say, just about Alabama and people of Alabama, Doug Jones, the now former senator, what prosecuted a number of the Birmingham bombing suspects. He's a white man from Alabama. Donald Trump's from Manhattan. So this is not simply a regional issue. This is something that there's racism and hate. But I take your point about humanizing people, and that's what you had in the South, of people who knew each other. And that's what we have to get back to, is to see the humanity in people, and not the differences. And we've really gotten away with that, away from that, in particular, if you look at what happened last week.
Correct.
People did not see the common humanity in each other.
All right. Well, I'm afraid to have to do this, but I have kept you guys way too long past, what I asked you to do, in part because this has just been a wonderful conversation, and just to listen to what you've had to say. And I also have to say that it has left me at the end of the conversation with more hope than I had.
Hey, Dave, before, can I just encroach?
Yeah.
In the role I occupy, and particularly over the last summer, in the police Black community, all the pain. And so to some of the answers, when I'm sitting at the dinner table with my wife and I deal with my three sisters as Black women, and they ask me the questions and they say, that could have been you, that could have been our son, that could have been, your nephew. So me personally, my struggle is, how do I have that discussion with my family, with my community, and with my men and women in blue? And so the struggle, and I would challenge each of you and say, how many of you actually live in that world who are challenged every day to work towards a solution rather than theorizing or intellectualizing?
No, I completely take your point. And, this was, and I live in the world of theorizing and intellectualizing, and I'll just, and I mentioned this on an earlier panel.
And I'm not judging.
Oh, no, I know you're not judging. I'm just, going to want to say that the difficulties of this. And, one of the things that I teach is violence in the law. And I was talking with a class about violence in the law. And, and one of the ways that I start this is I say, have you ever been in fear of violence? And many have not, but many have. And the young black man raised his hand, and I asked him, and he says, well, I was pulled over by the police on my way to Kenyon. And he feared for his life, simply for a speeding ticket. And that is, and as I mentioned in the panel, in my younger days, I was not always behaving the way I should. I had my own interactions with the police, but I never feared for my life. Right. And I think understanding that there can be these stark differences is really important. And if you, live in the world of intellectualizing it, the only way to learn is to talk to other people.
I think
engage in the process of empathy.
Yeah, and I think you need sustained intervention. We've lost that sustained intervention.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. But anyway, can I go on now?
Yes, I'm sorry.
I want to thank you guys for taking the time to speak with us tonight. As I was saying, I was much more pessimistic about the future of American democracy, and in particular, this important norm of the peaceful transfer of power coming into the conversation than I am going out, because I was heartened by the idea that no, our norms have held and there are pathways out, even if they may be difficult. And before we, completely close and sign off, what I would like to give each person the opportunity to do is mention anything that they think that they see as real important about understanding our current moment that we have not yet been able to address, because I know it is a deep and complex issue. And Jim, I'll start with you.
No, I've had my say.
Okay, Cully.
I guess the only thing I would say is more of a philosophical comment, and that is 50, 75 years from now, when we're all dead, but other people are running Kenyon panels like this, and historians are writing the books about this 4-year interregnum between President Obama and President X. One of the things that historians, especially constitutional scholars, will look at is, once again, the importance of the Electoral College and the process and the norms to certify elections. And I think my guess is, projecting 50, 75 years forward, is that people will still stand behind that. And there were good reasons to set up the Electoral College at the time it was happened. And I think 100 years from now, people will look back and say this was a stress test on that, but we survived it.
Okay. Paul?
I'm going to take an optimistic perspective and sort of address what Cully was saying about intolerance in higher education now. I see examples of something different in places like the University of Maryland, but it's happening in other places where there are students who purposefully get together to talk about difficult issues across divides. I just want to encourage the students, prospective students or current students at Kenyon, to take advantage of the atmosphere at Kenyon, which is, I think, conducive to having those kind of discussions. Get outside of your comfort zone, try to find people who are different and have some conversations and learn something about their perspective. There's no better place to do it than when you're in a higher education environment and you're asking questions. And I think Kenyon is a great environment to do that. So I would encourage that kind of those kind of discussions. I think you'll be pleased that you did.
Okay, Courtney?
Yeah, to jump off on that, I'd say the conversations, whether it's, you know, almost like the interfaith conversations they have in the Middle East, is to try to mix it up and listen and find some common ground. I never assume that I know who I'm talking to or what they believe. And I usually just try to ask about their kids or their family or their parents. Everyone has a story and they like to be heard. And I think that people like to help and people like to feel good about their community. And when you foster that, you can cut through the like 10% of the extreme and get back to a much better center of community by doing that, by listening and hearing and helping when you can, which is ultimately what you're saying is like Kenyon is what I used to call the great incubator. It's a wonderful community where you can kind of hatch and it's supposed to set you up for lifelong discussions like this. I'm still struggling over Shakespeare. I don't think Shakespeare ever even could have thought about this. And I'm still struggling in my little, you know, with Judy and American Lit, like what was this? I haven't figured out what it was yet. But I'm glad it was not. I'm glad that when I did a live from Russell Rotunda and they asked me, you know, you've been all these places in the world and seen so much. And at the very end of, I was struggling, you know, it was still happening. And I said, but this isn't Syria. It's going to be okay. We're not stuck with somebody we can't get out who's torturing our people. We're not, you know, there were going to be trials in New York about sexual assault, you know, of women. There's going to be all sorts of things and it's going to be ugly, but we kind of have to look at it as like a reconciliation and tribunal as well. So I just think if we kind of do that, not to be too kumbaya, but aren't we all Kenyan? You know, just to like collectively keep the dialogue going. Dialogue is the most important thing you can have.
Okay. And Larry, I'll let you have the last word.
I would say be careful about standing in judgment. I mean, you know, you look at the cover of a book and you think you can read it. We look at people and we don't know how they got to be how they are. And maybe that sustained intervention gives us the opportunity to dissect and listen and better understand. And if we can do those things, I think we can bring people along. One of the initiatives we started in law enforcement was Faith in the Blue, bringing the Black clergy together and taking our officers to interact and trying to get them to listen to one another and understanding how incredibly essential each is to the other in our communities.
Okay.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you all. And I also would like to, thank you, Paul. Thank you, Larry, Courtney, Jim, and Cully for participating in this discussion tonight. And I would especially like to thank the audience for the questions that you've provided and for listening in on this conversation. I tried to get to as many of the things that were coming through the chat as possible. I know that I did not address everyone's question, and in particular, there were a couple that came in at the very last minute that I really wanted to throw to the panel, but I want to also respect your time. But anyway, thank you so much for agreeing to participate on the panel. To the panelists and to the audience, thank you so much for listening in for a discussion about this most important moment in American political life. And I wish you all a good night.